Morning, Mary. How are you?
Kia ora, Leeroy. Very well, thanks. How's yourself?
I'm very well, thank you, Kia ora. Thanks for being on here and agreeing to be part of this podcast. So let's just start off with what's occupying your time at the moment in terms
Let's
of work?
in terms of work. Okay, so in terms
Yeah.
of work, I have this. I've been on a contract for the last sort of 6 months as the general manager of a new mental health charity for fishermen,
All
um,
right.
and it's called First Mate. Uh, so a complete change for me, which I have to say I am really enjoying. So we've got serious mental health issues and social issues for fishermen and their whanau. So this charity is set up to try and work alongside and address some of those issues. So we've got navigators around the country. And when I started, I knew zero about fishing. I'm learning quite a lot. So I could go into more detail, but possibly not for this podcast.
So it's quite a sea change, pardon the pun.
Oh, Leeroy, yes, yes, and quite outside my comfort zone and not quite my wheelhouse, but I'm getting there.
Is that something you've done in the past in terms of always gone outside your comfort zone in terms of
Um,
opportunities?
well, well, yes, probably. Always sort of suffering from that sort of imposter syndrome, um, and and I think yes, possibly. But sometimes I look back and I think when I was younger, as a young social worker, in my 20s, thinking about going and working with foster parents who had been fostering for 20, 30 years, had their own grown up families. And here I was as a 20-year-old, or, in my 20s, going in and talking to families about how they might like to support the young, challenging, child
Mm.
that they're caring for. I look back with absolute horror. So that wasn't imposter syndrome, that was overconfidence, to think, what on earth could you possibly teach these people?
Mm.
So it's a mixture of that sort of confidence of youth, and then the sort of, as I've got older and wiser, possibly the more of the, oh, can I actually do this?
And from that social work perspective, where
Mm.
where were you practicing social work at that point?
I I started off working for Catholic Social Services, which was a social work agency that really focused on working with young people and adolescents in the community. So this was back in the 80s, and it was we had a real focus on meaningful sort of employment for young people, which because there were
Hmm.
work schemes and all those sorts of things, which actually made a real difference for people, but also with the young people who were dislocated from their whānau, and obviously getting into trouble at times. Spent quite a lot of time working in prisons and correction facilities. So that was the start of my social work career. Then I went off and did a master's degree in social work, and then I moved completely from the young people and adolescents through to working with older people in the community, um, which was another complete change. And that was a wonderful opportunity. That was working with
Mm.
people who were living um, who were in the community, probably not very well supported, or they weren't very well supported, isolated, and relatively, poor as well. So,
Mm.
and what we did was this was with the Methodist social services. So I moved from the Catholics to the Methodists, quite agnostic there, um,
Right.
and our goal there was to take people where they were and offer them a whole range of support to keep them in their own homes and maintain their independence whilst providing sort of social connection. It was a great
Mm.
program when I think back on it, again in
Mm.
the 80s, early 90s, and made a real difference to people, older people,
Mm.
who were at the risk of going into residential care prematurely.
Yeah. And where were you practicing? Where was that? Was that in Taranaki or was that in
That
Wellington
was
or
in that was in Wellington. That was in
in
Wellington,
Wellington?
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so all those work
Um,
that work was in Wellington. So Taranaki, I was born in Taranaki and brought up there, went to school there.
yeah. Well, we'll get back to that a little bit later. I mean, I think those things are still, a problem now, aren't they? With
Yeah,
isolated older folk and trying to
a-
maintain them at home as much as possible.
absolutely, and dislocated young people. So we haven't
Yeah.
come very far, have we?
Mm.
It's that lack
Mm.
of, with older people particularly, I just noticed that lack of connection and meaningful relationships, um,
Yeah.
and living in fairly constrained circumstances, and so the choices were really limited as well.
Mm.
Um,
And so from there, what was the next step?
so then I went. So that I loved that. That was a new program that we set up, and then went on to manage that services for older people for Wesley. So that was across their private hospitals, rest homes, and the community. So that was probably the big step into um, more senior management, and that was again really, we did some really exciting things there, and that was really trying to change the model of residential care again, trying to move away from the care being for um, set up for the convenience of staff to sort of an individualized care model for each person. What do they need? What was important?
Yeah.
And how could we personalize the care to suit what the individual needed? Look, I can't say that we succeeded necessarily at that. The institutional sort of model was so ingrained, not just for the staff and management, but for residents as well. So
Mm.
that was a real challenge.
So
Um,
it sounds like there's these projects that you started, which were very innovative at the time. They probably still would be innovative now,
yeah,
but just that kind of balance between the patients or the person-centered approach versus the institutionalized approach, and how you manage that was the
such a
difference.
challenge, and I think I think if there was a theme, that would be the theme running through my career really,
Right.
and and hard to affect change. But as a social worker, that person-centered approach was kind of second. That's who we are as social workers. You're
Yeah.
focusing on a person-centered and trying to move away from that task focus to a
Yeah.
person-centered approach.
And how
And
did you get
those,
into social? Sorry, go on.
no, after you.
I was going to say, how did you get into social work?
So I was brought up in a Catholic family, one of 8 children, and went to a state primary school, small, rural primary school, and then went to a Catholic girls' school in New Plymouth. And I don't know, I was very lucky. It was the early 70s. Feminism and um, anti-racism was kind of high on our agenda at 15. We
Mm.
had, and I think it was because we had some very progressive Catholic nuns, sisters, who the principal was in her early 30s, and she was and is a wonderful role model. She was a historian and taught me history, and it was the opportunity. She just exposed us to all to social justice, and I guess it came from my family as well. So that sense of social justice, social action, wanting to make a difference. My mum and dad modelled that. We used to have foster kids come to stay, and I guess we were always thinking about how well off we were comparatively to other people. Um, and then I thought, right, well, I quite like this. I quite think I like thinking about helping people, but caring about those issues. And then I went and got a job, left school in seventh form, didn't finish at secondary school, went and got a job at social welfare as that it was, and was working in benefits, the benefit part of
Mm.
the social welfare, thinking, oh, this would be a good way to get into social work, but not really having any idea what social work was. Um,
Right.
and I worked in the benefits section of in New Plymouth, um, and that was working with older people and sickness benefit. Now,
Mm.
that required all the skills that I didn't have. So, attention to detail, being methodical, focused, and just, and and that's an important piece of work, but it certainly wasn't me. And
Mm.
so I soon realized that it wasn't me. I used to have piles and piles, it was all paper, remember, piles and piles of paper files. And I always remember my supervisor said to me, your job is not to try and help people. Your job is not to talk to people. Your job is to get them their benefits sorted.
Right.
and that was absolutely true. And I wasn't good at that role, so I went off overseas for a few years, did all the great sort of travel like all New Zealanders do.
Mm.
Worked in the UK, came back and did a history degree and religious studies, and then was looking around for a role, and a Catholic social services job came up, and that was me.
Mm.
Started there as a youth worker, moved on to social work, became a senior social worker, then went off to university and did my masters in social
Yeah.
work.
Yeah. Now, earlier on, for those people who aren't watching, I mean, you did inverted commas around around helping people, and obviously the story around you're not there to help people, you're there to get them their benefits. Is is that why you put the quotation marks around it, or
Well,
was there
I
another?
think helping people, because there was a bit of the savior,
Yeah,
I want to help people. I guess I've moved a bit from there, but yes, it was more around the helping than anything. Um,
yeah,
the savior, you know.
yeah. There's a little bit of it's about enabling people to have their own
Yes,
um,
very much so.
agency
And
and show their
autonomy
own
and
resilience. Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. But at
yeah.
age 17, 18, you don't really know that.
No. Well, that's what we're taught,
Idealistic.
isn't it? As yes, go through the system, and your approach is to try and help as many people as possible. And I'm sure there's many students out there who had interviews for jobs where they said, "Why do you want this job?" Because they want to help people
And
in
actually they
healthcare.
do, and it's
Yeah,
genuine and it's real, and I did,
yeah,
but not quite as paternalistically as that.
yeah,
Moving in my later life and experience,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
And getting back to Taranaki, so that upbringing there,
yeah.
what sort of skills do you think that taught you? Obviously, you talked about your family, and there was that social justice kind of time, but also from the family perspective, and one of eight as well.
One of
So,
eight.
how did that upbringing sort of shape you? Do you think?
So in the middle, so um, we had a fairly free range um, upbringing. So on a farm,
Yeah.
um, my father had to work very hard to get his farm, so it wasn't inherited. Like he worked in factories for 7 or 8 years to get the farm. So a fairly, looking back now, probably a reasonably constrained upbringing financially.
Mm,
Things improved as we got older, of course. Um, so free range, I mean by that we kind of disappeared from 8 o'clock in the morning till the sun went down. Um, Came back for food, like everyone does on a farm. But when I
mm,
think about it, in terms of parenting, there were rivers, there were ponds. We were all just roaming around. Um, One of my vivid memories before I went to school was looking after my sister, who was 3, who tipped herself. We were playing by a trough full of water. She tipped herself into the trough, and all my father could see were 2 little red gumboots poking out.
mm,
Dad plucked her out, but I got growled at. That was my responsibility at 4 and a bit to be keeping an eye on this 3 year
mm,
old. So fairly, we weren't cosseted. It was pretty much get out there and do it, take some responsibility. So what did it teach me? I think being in the middle there, we were peacemakers. I was a peacemaker.
mm-hmm,
I think that's the role you play in that sort of middle bunch.
mm-hmm,
Not the leaders, out the front breaking the new ground. Not the little ones behind. But in that sort of solid middle block, um, and peacemaker, resilience. I think 4 older brothers, pretty rough, pretty tough.
mm, mm.
So you learnt to muck in and muck along.
And
I think
responsibility.
responsibility, and also that how to get on with people, because when you've got 8, you and everyone with different personalities, how do you sort of find a way to get along with each other?
Yeah.
Also, the moving and changing dynamics as everyone got older, and things changed, and so your resilience, I guess.
Mm.
Resilience,
And was
yeah.
there a history of other relatives in the family being farmers? What was the attraction for your dad to move
Yeah,
from factory work to become a farmer?
so he was brought up. My grandfather was a was a dairy farmer, small farm, and so Dad was brought up on a farm, but he was one of 11. Um,
Right.
yeah. So, and of course, he was brought up during the war. So his brothers, he was too young to go to war, but his brothers went to the Second World War, and so Dad was his sort of role was to pick fruit um, in Featherston, I think, for his war effort at 14. So when you think about these 14-year-old kids,
Mm.
and his other younger brothers were managing this small farm. So there were 11 of them. There's only one small farm. So you had to go off and um, get a job, and that's what he did, and work
Yeah.
to save some money to get a mortgage to get onto the farm.
Yeah.
So big Catholic rural family with on the road I lived on. I had I have three other aunties and uncles, and all their families living on the same road. So
Right.
pretty close. Church
Mm.
was really important. Um,
Yeah.
Sunday mass was that was important, and family was important.
Mm.
Yeah.
And what
So
about your mum?
so
What did
mum
your
was
mum
she
do?
came she was a primary school teacher, and she came from the Wairarapa. So she was, and her father came over from Scotland, and he was in the First World War. I think he had a very tough time, um, and they were they really did struggle. They got some land after the war, um, and small farm. Mum was one of two, a Presbyterian. She came to Stratford, Taranaki to teach, and met Dad there, um, and then they married and had these 8 children. So Mum was um, not from a large Catholic family; she was from a small Scottish Presbyterian family, quite different.
Mm. Mm.
She was quite intelligent, very intelligent, and probably an introvert. When I think about it, my father was an
Mm.
extrovert. She was probably an introvert. I don't know how she coped with that um, large Irish Catholic family
Right. Right. And so you've got Irish and Scottish roots. Did you go
and
to Ireland and
Polish
Scotland and
and
Polish as well?
Polish.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
Right. So have you been
and
back to
Swiss.
those three countries?
I have,
And
not to Poland and
four
Swiss.
countries.
Yeah, I've been to Switzerland, Scotland, and Ireland. So yes, I have. And probably the strongest influence, because my grandfather was born in Scotland and he had brothers and sisters and um,
Mm.
relatives in Scotland when I was 18, 19. I spent time with them. And I must say that's where I felt a real affinity with Scotland. That
Right.
felt, I thought when I went over that border, yeah, this is, I felt like a spiritual connection, and the family
And
and the land.
where in Scotland was
Stranraer,
were your folks from?
Stranraer,
Stranraer.
Stranraer.
Right.
Yeah.
And
So
what about the Irish connection? Whereabouts were they in Ireland?
County Clare. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So so but that felt more distant. I mean, that didn't feel as connected
Hmm.
because it was, several generations in New Zealand, but with that
Yeah.
first generation felt stronger. And the Swiss, that's sort
Yeah.
of on the border of the Italian Swiss border, I think, and German, so German speaking.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the Polish roots, you haven't got back to Poland.
Oh, I I think my family know, but I'm not quite sure about that Polish one. I don't want to make it up, but I could. But yeah, there was a Polish grandmother. A lot of
Yeah.
Polish people
Yeah.
in Taranaki, as you probably remember.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
One of the things I remember about Taranaki, and we've spoken over the years. Obviously, I moved from the UK to Taranaki, and that's probably where I realised I wanted to do palliative care. But one of the things that always struck me about Taranaki was that sense of community, and you know, people looking out for each other, people helping each other. Probably because they were on that North Island, just a little bit remote from other places,
yeah.
and just got on and looked after each other and did what they needed to do. And I was always surprised going to the various meetings we had over the years from palliative care perspective, hearing about the problems in other services, and thinking we're pretty good with what we're
It's
doing.
yeah, yeah. It's pretty special, isn't it? And of course, I
Yeah.
couldn't wait to get away. because at 17, as a young person, it felt constrained and it was hard to. It felt isolated, and I always thought it was
Mm.
terribly conservative, um, but it probably wasn't. It was just a microcosm of the rest of the world. Um,
Yeah.
but you're right about that sense of, and now when I look back, I realise just how important that was, that sense of community and um, resilience. I think, and the
Mm.
thing, and I'm sure you would have seen this, and I think I'm probably like this as well. Pretty down to earth. There's not many
Yeah.
airs and graces in Taranaki, are there?
No.
No
No.
one really.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah. No. If you can't deal with people as they are, then you're not going to do well in Taranaki.
no. Which is probably why you did so
Really.
well, because you were much loved there, as I remember.
Oh well, that's kind of you. That was good to know. It's good feedback, but it's kind of you to say. So, how did you get into the hospice area from those beginnings?
So, so it was one of those sort of flukes, really, when I think about it. So I was in my late 30s. I was a single mother. I had one son, Vincent, and he was 5, and I was working for the Methodists. And then I just saw this role advertised as um, chief executive or general manager, I think, as it was then, of Mary Potter Hospice. I didn't know. I knew about palliative care, but I didn't know really anything about it.
Mm.
And I just decided to go for it. And when I look back, I think again, gosh, late 30s. Um, I don't, they must have seen something in me because I got the role, and spent 11, 12 years there.
Mm.
And I learned it was a real culture shock going from aged care, where we were chronically underfunded, um, undervalued. People used to say to me,
Mm.
why are you working with old people? Ooh. Um,
Mm.
why, how could you not, why, especially my social work colleagues used to say, oh, old people, don't you
Mm.
prefer young people? So there was that stigmatization was already in place. And so when I went from aged care, which was, challenging in terms of staffing levels and resources, and then going to the
Mm.
hospice, it just felt such a luxury. It just felt
Mm.
this full multidisciplinary team, um, the community support, single focus. It felt such a luxury to go and
Mm.
face. And I found that transition really quite difficult, to be honest. I
Mm.
think it was. I felt, gosh, all it did for me was just say this sort of stark reality of how challenging it is for residential aged care.
Mm.
Um,
The
and
lack of equity in terms of service
lack of
provision.
equity, lack of equity in terms of service provision, and then just the whole how the community viewed hospice care,
Mm.
vis-a-vis how they view residential care. So
Aged
that
care.
was that was really stark.
Mm.
Um, but there I was,
So
again,
another leap into the unknown.
complete unknown and a leap of faith. And when I think about it, looking back now, a bit similar to the young social worker. I mean, gosh, what did I know about being the chief executive of a much loved organisation, and the community really held Mary Potter in very high regard, and so that was um, another huge jump off into the unknown, as you say.
Mm. And so, from the years in Mary Potter, that service developed quite remarkably, if I hear the stories correctly. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how that kind of developed under your leadership?
Well, I was very lucky, of course, because when I arrived, Rod McLeod was the medical director, and together with the sort of senior team, we just made um, a great partnership, really, and a great team.
Mm.
Rod taught me so much about palliative care, so much about the holistic care. I mean, I learned all of that really from him. Um, and I think he appreciated the fact that I wasn't from a nursing or nursing background, but I was from a social work background. So that holistic, like focusing on sort of
Yeah.
the emotional and physical and the psychological aspects of care and family and all of that. I think that's what we sort of connected on that. And so we were lucky that we worked so well together, and we had different skills and different strengths, and we were able. We sort of had the freedom to really look at the service and say, so what we saw was a lot of focus on the inpatient unit,
Mm.
very well resourced, and very little focus on community.
Mm.
So if you were lucky enough to be one of the 18 at the time to be in the inpatient unit, fabulous. But if you weren't, well, not so good. So I guess that was the thing that I'm most proud of, was that, and with wonderful teams. I mean, there were some wonderful people. We worked with some nursing colleagues um, who who together we set up a community model with community hubs and
Mm.
with palliative care coordinators, and so took that service from being very inpatient focused to community focused.
And I
And I
spoke
think that
to.
made us, sorry,
Sorry, go on. Think you made that.
I just
That
think that
made
made a
you.
huge difference where we put, and it wasn't just nursing and medical, it was the psychosocial, spiritual aspects of care as well. So
Mm.
we sort of had teams, regional teams with all the professions working together, interdisciplinary. And I think that made a huge difference to the
Mm.
care that people received outside of the inpatient unit.
Yeah. I think communities still very challenging for most palliative care services by comparison to inpatient. But I mean, it kind of makes sense in some respects. But that's where the real support in people's homes and going into people's homes and seeing how they're coping or not coping, and where you can make a difference to sort of keeping them at home. Hugely important. Um, I had a chat with Ria Earp recently,
Mm,
and her after her birthday honours lists
yeah, wonderful.
accolade, which you also have got, and Rod's also got. So, where was Ria in that kind of time? Was she there
So
when you
Ria,
were there, or
no, Ria, when I moved to Hospice New Zealand, Ria was appointed chief executive following me, so she came
right?
directly after me, um,
Okay,
and she
and I
brought all that she brought to the role
yeah,
as well.
and I didn't realise that she had a social work background as well.
She sure does. Yeah.
Yeah. So after all these years, I've now discovered you've got a social work background, and Ria never knew.
Who knew?
So then the Hospice New Zealand role.
Then Hospice New
So another
Zealand. So
chief exec role.
another chief exec role, and so Mary Potter was wonderful, and but after that, after 11 years or so, it was time to think about something new. And I think it's important for the organisation, and it was important for me to think about what I did next.
Mm.
So then I looked at, and then the Hospice New Zealand role came up, um, and that wasn't such a leap because I knew about Hospice New Zealand, and I'd worked
Mm.
with them. Um, but it was a huge shift, and now looking back, it was a really challenging role, because the role of Hospice New Zealand wasn't necessarily understood, and it wasn't particularly valued either.
Mm.
So going from being the chief executive of Mary Potter, the oldest hospice, it had status and it had
Yeah.
recognition and all of those things, and going to Hospice New Zealand, we're working in some little back office somewhere, and poorly resourced and unclear of our roles, and
Mm.
certainly not valued or appreciated by necessarily even by the sector. So um, that was a learning curve,
Mm.
and I took a big reduction in salary and all sorts of things. But I felt that the reason why I did it was I thought that I could we could make a difference to, the skill sets are the same, aren't they? If you think about being a social worker to being a manager to being a chief executive to being, moving to a national role, the skill sets are the same, and it's about connection, relationships,
Mm.
and leading change. And so I thought, well, I think there's an opportunity here to strengthen palliative care and hospice care nationally. So that's why I made that move.
What
And
was the
it
biggest
wasn't without its
surprise in
challenges.
yeah what was the biggest surprise that you encountered? Because obviously you would have heard about different services around the country, and obviously from Mary Potter you kind of said that was quite a difference from obviously what you experienced in aged care, but certainly there would have been differences of different palliative care services around the country that you would have to
Phenomenal differences.
yeah yeah
Phenomenal differences. And seeing those from a national perspective sort of unearthed for me huge inequities. Inequities in terms of the delivery of service, huge inequities in terms of capacity and capability, if I'm really honest, um, and and uh, sort of the lack of consistency of what was provided as well. So hospices in New Zealand sort of all grew up, as you will know, all grew up sort of differently from different sort of origins, and there's a real sense that whatever hospice I was talking to, their way, their model was absolutely the right way, um, and
mm,
and and there was no place to think about. We might learn from what so and so is doing on the next hospice bordering us. It was a very interesting dynamic, and
mm,
so on one level, seemingly quite collegial, but also there was some real tensions around the models of care. So
yeah
very interesting seeing that.
yeah
Um,
that kind of
and
challenge between a national perspective and local people, local needs.
and how important that is to have a local need in responding to local communities, but there is some benefit in having consistency. And so some of the exciting things we did was sort of refocus on standards, and so we had national standards and national
Mm,
education programs, um, and worked quite hard to sort of try and get some. Can't say I succeeded in this, but try and get some consistency with funding as well. Um,
mm,
because the inconsistencies with funding across the country were just so marked. So places like Mary Potter were really well funded in comparison to other hospice services that were, in some cases, nearly 50% more well funded. So it was real
mm,
challenges around that equity um, and and the models of care, and trying to create some consistency.
mm. I know when I
Yeah.
moved to Aotearoa, the kind of Hospice New Zealand website was one of the places I went to, and it was very well kind of set up at that time. And also the breakfast sessions that Genesis
Oh yeah,
Oncology,
that was another.
um,
Yeah.
that was great. I mean, had a national thing, and you could hear from different people around the country, and that early start to get that bit of enthusiasm for the day was always very useful. So you started that as well during that time.
No,
That
I
all right?
can't. I can't take credit for that. That was already going, but I think we probably changed the
All right.
focus a wee bit. Um,
Yeah.
Rachel Wilson, who worked with me, who has been responsible for the comms and um, a huge amount and the funding and everything that Rachel's done. Her and Rod used to work on that program, and it was, um, and because Rod, I think, kind of knew everybody everywhere. We were so lucky. We had such a high caliber um, of
Mm,
guest speakers, so we were very, very lucky. Very
yeah.
lucky.
Yeah.
So no, I can't take credit, but I think we probably changed the focus a wee bit.
Mm. So you've mentioned Rod. You've mentioned um, the nun that was quite progressive in her thinking.
S- Sister Barbara Cameron, yes.
So Sister Barbara as well. Are there any other people that you think influenced how you developed and practiced to where you are now over the years?
I think probably one of the key influences was a woman, a old friend of mine, a good friend of mine called Kitty McKinley, who is a social worker who was senior social worker when I started at Catholic Social Services. I think she was a huge influence on me. Um, her courage and her strength and she just went into bat for people, and she would not back down. She was just the greatest example of how important it is if people have someone who's championing them, how important it is for individuals and for families and whanau to have. And she was a fighter. She's a street fighter, and hugely driven by. She's an idealist, and I had dinner with her the other night, and nothing's changed. She's sitting there, at 66, and nothing's changed. She's still
Mm.
fighting the good fight for equity, and I look at her, and hers was about sticking with people. She's got people, she's influenced and changed people's lives, and she's still in their lives. So
Mm.
she was a great believer that relationships, positive relationships, are sort of a great healer. And if you haven't, as a child or a young person, you haven't had that in your life, you haven't had someone who's been consistent, and
Mm.
who will be there for you. Um, she modeled that to me. Now, it's sort of, classic sort of social work. Boundaries, probably boundaries weren't something that she didn't went beyond boundaries. For her, it was about the individual, the person in front of her. What they need is someone to care about them, irrespective of when, how, what they've done. And that,
Mm.
to me, that I've been hugely influenced by that. Um, Caring for people, standing up for people, fighting injustice where you see it, doesn't fit with neat social work paradigms sometimes,
Mm.
or
Mm.
management, or palliative care, or sometimes you just have to go in, boots and all, and advocate for and on behalf of, and that value of that
Yeah.
relationship was central, and that's hugely influenced me. Um,
Yeah.
and she's made a huge difference and inspired many people, um, and made a big difference to a lot of people's lives.
Mm. Those boundaries. I mean, most people in healthcare go a little bit beyond the boundary because they have to. I mean, that's just how you are going to advocate and support people the best you can. Um, that boundary sounds like it was a challenge for you as well over the years.
Oh yeah, always, always. And I used to always boundaries, but yes. And I found being a chief executive at Mary Potter, what I really enjoyed was actually having any excuse to connect with
Mm.
patients and whānau, and that's what I love. But I could step back in and out of that, because I always thought, you know, what I'm doing at this level actually does have a direct impact, on those people and on their whānau. But I still really love that contact. I really enjoyed that, finding a connection,
Mm.
and so yes, boundaries, but not irresponsibly, I don't think.
Yeah.
Because I think
I think
there's
there's.
nothing worse than chief executives who want to be social workers and not actually doing their role as chief executive, but being able to connect, and that was as much for me as it was for anyone else. It was actually about the motivation, and how to keep motivated and focused and engaged, because
Yeah.
that passion was driven by that connection.
Yeah. I suppose there's a wisdom in knowing when a boundary is probably not the best boundary that should have been in place.
A- Absolutely, and I look back and I think when I was younger and more inexperienced, I'm not sure that I always got that. I know I didn't get that right, but
Mm.
but as you get older, or more experienced, then and of course, like all good social workers, I've had supervision, professional supervision, all of my life, all of
Mm.
my working life, whether I was a chief executive or a social worker or a manager. So that professional supervision,
Mm.
has been sort of central to my professional working life.
Yeah.
Being able
And
to
that's
check
hugely
in,
important.
yeah, or
Yeah.
to
Being able
someone
to
who's
check in.
removed from the situation, yeah, check in, reflect, um, and I'm quite a harsh critic of myself, and I'm trying hard not to be quite so harsh, but I was, I could have done this. I could focus very much and very quickly on things that hadn't gone well, um,
Yeah.
and so, but I do think it's important because and it's a bit of a cliche, but you really only do learn from the things that don't go well.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where
Yeah.
the true growth happens, and I've got lots of my career is littered with those.
Mm. And I remember being in Auckland and having regular clinical supervision um, on a monthly basis, paid for by the hospice. It was
Mm,
I was very fortunate to be able to have that, and a great person as a clinical supervisor to actually just reflect. He was Peter Johnson was his name, and many people in Auckland would know him. But he would sit there and listen to you speaking about the things that are on your mind, and would summarize and then give you some strategies to go forward with. He wasn't just there to listen and counsel
oh
you.
no, no,
He
no.
gave you some great strategies to go forward with, which was always very helpful, I think. But yeah, I'm always a bit sort of perplexed that certainly medical and nursing don't have the same clinical supervision as social work or other
No,
disciplines.
no. And also a good supervisor will really hold up a mirror and and particularly if you've built up a relationship, and they'll say to you, so
Mm,
I'm seeing, real patterns here, when you start to and drawing all those things together. And so I found the accountability really helpful
mm,
because I found not only was I accountable to the organisation, but I felt that I was accountable to the supervisor and to my own practice, and then ultimately to who I was serving, whether it be, you know, um, residents, patients, or the team. Leading and
mm,
managing teams requires a lot of reflection, um, and openness and willingness to say, "Gosh, I got that really wrong. I've
mm,
misjudged." So that's where I found supervision so helpful.
mm.
Um, and that,
And
yeah.
just thinking back, because you said, being the middle in the 8 kids, you were the peacemaker, but also you've got this passion for standing up for people and going potentially sometimes over the boundaries that you might have
Mm.
professionally in the right way, in a positive way, with wisdom. How did that balance out? Because obviously, being a peacemaker is one thing. That kind of was that how you developed your diplomacy to sort of fight battles in different ways? How did that work?
That's that's a very good, astute question. I think that's always been a tension, a personal tension. So that peacemaker, and sitting with the peacemaker is kind of that desire to be liked and to be one of the team, and so that's quite a strong driver. And then, as you
Mm,
say, the leadership work, it's quite lonely. You can be out the front. Um, you you people are resistant, people don't like it, they don't like you, they don't like the change. And so that's always been a tension for me, always.
mm,
And have I resolved that? Probably no, probably not, to be honest. Right to this day, it's a I know what the right thing is to do. I know I need to, to be accountable and be responsible, and I know that this makes people feel uncomfortable, and I really don't enjoy that at all still. And so that's a real tension for me. It's an ongoing tension.
I'm sure it's a tension that you deal with better than you used to, and certainly with clinical supervision,
Oh,
that allows you
definitely.
to
Yeah,
definitely work
yeah,
better with it. Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, I think
exactly.
we all
Yeah,
will have those struggles of trying to get there, but we may never get there, and it's just that
we may never get
continuing
there.
work.
We may never get there.
Yeah,
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly. But it's an astute observation of yours because it's a theme running through my whole career and probably my personal life as well.
Mm. And you mentioned um, Vincent was your first
Vincent,
son,
my only
and
son, my
did,
one child.
only
Yep.
son. Sorry.
Yeah.
Um, so how then? Because I know you're spending a lot of time with granddaughter.
Daughters,
daughters.
2 granddaughters. Yep.
So that transition with Vincent as you were working and taking on new positions, there was also there's another balance there that obviously women will have in terms of raising a family and also doing this professional role. How did that work out for him? And then how do you see that kind of playing out now with your grandchildren?
How did that work? I was incredibly lucky to have very close family here in Wellington. So my sisters and I, and have lived together. One of my sisters and I have lived together, or we've lived near each other. Um,
Mm,
and so, whilst I was a single parent, I've never really felt that I was doing it by myself. I've always had really good family support. But like any, and you've identified this already, like any working woman, um, it's hard, and being a single mother and having, demanding roles was always a challenge, and you never felt you were quite, you know, giving enough to both.
mm,
But I was very fortunate to have very good family support. Vincent has been was a bright, at times very naughty boy. Um, his mother was a bit free range in the way she brought him up as well, so pretty loose. But I have to say he's turned into a remarkable man with beautiful father with his 2 daughters. Um,
mm,
so so I'm very proud of what he's done, and he cares about the world and about people, and so I'm very proud of him. And as I say, he's a remarkable father. And
mm.
these little girls are just the absolute joy of my life.
Mm.
They bring
Oh, I could
so
tell
much
that.
joy.
I
They
could
bring
tell that from our
so
recent
much joy.
conversation.
Yeah, they bring so much joy, Leroy. It's just pleasure. And
Mm,
I've decided to make a commitment to supporting them so that Vincent and his lovely partner Ailey can do what they need to do with their careers, and it's wonderful for everyone. We've got
mm,
these little girls in our lives, and so I'm committed to providing sort of very regular time with them, um, and it's a wonderful thing.
mm.
It's good for everyone.
It is. It is. I mean, I think. My mother raised me as a single mother
Mm.
in the UK,
Mm.
coming from the Caribbean, and you can't. I think there's maybe a concern that how's that going to transpose into your own parenting, um, because you've had one person that's been mother and father, as it were, and challenges obviously to keep working, but also to give that parenting that you think you need. So then how are you going to translate that to be a parent yourself? So it's wonderful to hear that he's doing that so well, because I think that is, for me, that was a concern. And how would
Oh,
I be a parent without the usual parenting?
Absolutely, and I was worried about that, Leroy. Vincent was born in '89, and the whole sort of model paradigm then was, children, boys especially need strong male role models, and I agree, they do. Um, but there's more than one way to achieve that.
Mm,
I had, my father and my brothers were very involved in his life, and Vincent did go to an all boys Catholic school, which I believe was one of the best decisions I ever made for him on his behalf. He didn't want to go to that school; he wanted to go to another. But I thought this was really important because he was a bit free range. He did need a bit of discipline, um, and he needed um, he needed this incredible school that nurtured young men, and he's still very close
mm,
friends with all those boys now. And I look at them all and seeing these wonderful boys being fabulous fathers. It's wonderful. So I agree. It was always a worry for me, um,
mm.
but I think there's more than one model of how you can parent.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast the other day about this kind of the feminine side and the masculine side, and
Mm,
there needs to be a balance between the two, rather than the kind of stereotypical boys need to have masculine, or even society, you have to have masculine traits only. There has to be a
Yeah,
balance between feminine and masculine traits to
absolutely,
actually,
absolutely.
survive well.
I think so. I
So
think
yeah,
so, and I've probably got a few masculine traits as well. So um, I think
but
we did the best we could.
we
We
all,
muddled along, don't we? And I'm sure your mum and I, we just
yeah,
muddled along and did the best we could do. And in the end, these boys are not too bad looking at you and looking at him. So
yeah, yeah. So now you've got this new role and a new
yeah,
priority in terms of the granddaughters that you
yeah,
are making sure you have time with during the week, which you probably wouldn't have had with the kind of hospice work over the years in terms of the time that you
mm-hmm.
devoted. In terms of the passion now, like you said, it's a very different kettle of fish, but very, again, another pun, but very important in terms of well-being. I mean, psychological well-being, huge now post-COVID.
Really,
Always
really
was a
big,
problem, but obviously
of
highlighted
course.
with COVID.
Yeah. So I took 14 months off after I finished. I really needed a break, and I didn't realize just how much I needed it. I
Mm,
was running very much on empty. I was exhausted, and so I took a full 14 months off. And to be honest, I thought I'd sort of semi-retired. Um,
mm,
I was still doing some voluntary work. I'm on a board of a residential care facility, so I was doing that. That was the only thing I was doing, and I just focused on exercise and joined a gym and sleep and all of those things. Um, and and then this role came up, and I realised, well, I don't think I really quite want to be retired, and I like this job and I like the work, and mental health and well-being is so important. And then thinking about this targeted this group, fishermen and their families, or fishers, um, you know, historically underserved, um, a bit like the rural sector and farmers, which I get, toughen up.
mm,
Um, it's a tough environment. They work very hard, like farmers, and you just get on with it. But quite isolating. All of those things that that we know are really can really compromise people's mental health and well-being.
yeah.
So, so I feel like I can bring the sort of all those skills in a role that I feel like, again, that I can make a difference because it's a new charity, and there's a lot to be done. No one knows about us, so we're sort of starting right at the very beginning, and that's great. Feels like a full circle really when I think about it, and I hope that I can make a difference, and contribute.
I think from what we've heard, you'll undoubtedly make a big difference because those skills that you say, and like you say, that population of people that are going out and facing things, excuse me, in the seas,
Mm,
like you say, it's a lonely place. You have one encounter out there with nature, and that can be very difficult to go back out there, I'd imagine.
incredible,
Um,
yeah,
and
and so
obviously
at the mercy.
there'll be things that would
So
happen as well that you you have to sort of work out how you're going to go out there again to get the livelihood. That's your job.
it's a hard livelihood, but people, they love the sea and they respect the sea. But you're quite right. So the cyclones, and all these terrible weather events and the effects of climate change, hugely impacted by that. Um,
Mm,
and there's a lot of legislation and changes and regulations which are hugely affected by. And I'm not really talking about the big companies. I'm talking about these sort of mother and father sort of setups, with one boat, and that's it's tough financially. It's tough um, physically, and these events have huge impacts. And COVID, as you rightly identified, was just really. I mean, it was so hard for them. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges ahead, but I love the people. They are very down to earth and very warm, and it's wonderful.
mm. I'm just thinking that there's a connection there in terms of facing the unknown. So obviously with palliative care, we're facing the unknown, and trying to navigate that, but there's a respect, hopefully, with clinicians understanding that we do have to respect the unknown. We do have to sort of bear in mind that things can go very different ways, and we're there to try and
Mm.
support as much as possible. I suppose there's that unknown and respect for the sea, and there's lots of analogies between the sea and life and death.
Death,
So
very much
there's
so.
a big connection. Do you think that the people are the same in terms of um, that? You said that they are obviously very warm and welcoming, but also there's that respect there, and also you're championing their cause. Do you find that in comparison to the palliative care people that you were dealing with over the years, that there's a similarity there with the two, or are they very
Do you
different?
mean do you mean with do you mean with the fishers themselves and patients, or do you mean the navigators and staff?
I think the fishers themselves, with that kind of respect for the unknown, does that carry over from the
Yeah,
palliative care community?
I think so. I think so. Absolutely, there is a respect for the unknown. There's kind of a resilience, um, and and a bit like patients and families, they're kind of on this in this process, and it's seasonal and cyclical, and and
Mm,
that's life and death, isn't it? So very much so,
yeah.
and yeah, I think there are similarities, um, and as I've said, sort of the courage and the resilience and all those things that you see when people are facing the end of life. I definitely see that with these guys,
Mm,
and it's hard, and it's hard for them to reach out and ask for help. And so
mm,
how we remove the stigma and normalize that. So that's when you think about it. No one wanted to talk about death and dying. People still feel uncomfortable talking about death and dying. Um,
mm,
so it's not dissimilar, is it, when we're talking about mental health? Again, that's it's the stigma, and so we really need to. That's part of what we're trying to do, is break down some of those stigmas.
mm. And from a mental health perspective across New Zealand with COVID, because I think you guys probably dealt with COVID better than most countries. How is that translated from the mental health um, kind of approach across New Zealand? So obviously, with your sector, there's a huge issue, but there must be other sectors where there also is a.
Oh, I think it's changed us as a people. I think it's changed us. Um, and we saw some wonderful things, but people it highlighted um, isolation, uncertainty, all those issues of uncertainty, um, and isolation, um, how interdependent we are on each other. Um, and I've seen I don't know, this is my sense is that I've seen a real change in attitudes, and not necessarily for the better. I've sort of seen division. There seemed, I believe it. We did really well, but gosh, the byproduct of the leadership of the Prime Minister and the Director General of Health, their leadership and really putting the well-being of the population at the heart of everything. The division that's caused, the negativity. I feel like we've been changed as a country, um,
Mm,
and that sort of net populist, that sort of whole thing that's happening internationally is kind of happening here as well.
mm,
Misinformation, all of those things. We have to fight against that, and just reassert, goodness and kindness and community. And I feel that's something that I feel sad about, and I've seen it. And I don't know if it's the same in Australia, but we've certainly seen it here.
mm,
Division and polarization.
mm. Well, I was going to ask you what would be your final kind of message or story to leave for everyone to consider, but I think you've actually just said that with answering that question and commenting on the changes you've seen. And I think, given the passion that you've had for advocacy and social justice and the way that you've gone about it, that certainly I've seen, but certainly many other people have seen, and that's kind of part of um, your honours that's been awarded to you as well. I think that we should take heed about your comments about the future and what you've seen. It's certainly an important way that we all have to think about our societies and how we're moving, and mental health's a big part of that, and how we face the unknowns also another big part of that, and
Really.
being kind and
And
working
be
together.
kind, and actually and we all can contribute, and it doesn't have to be grand or big. Just that engagement and connecting, and on the street saying it. I don't know. It's just I think there's all of us every day can do things that make a difference to how we feel about ourselves, but more importantly, how we can help someone else just by engaging, being kind to people when you go into a shop, all those sorts of things. I mean, it sounds trite, but
Yeah,
actually it does make a difference, because that's what we can influence, is how we are. Um, so, yeah, that's probably the most important thing that I'm going to try and focus on in the next little while.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's difficult to change the many things that are going on, but yeah, those differences that we can make on an individual basis, day in, day out, at least they mean something to us, that
Yeah,
we are making a
absolutely.
difference in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so, Mary, thank you so much for your time and wisdom today, and sharing your story with everyone. Like I say, it's always great to do these kind of interviews and hear different sides of people that you never knew about. So it's lovely to hear that things are working out in terms of work, and obviously you haven't completely retired, but also that family life is also going really well, and you're spending that time, precious time, with your granddaughters and your son. So more power to you in terms of
No,
what you're doing.
Leroy, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you, and I wish you all the very best with this. It's a great thing that you're doing. So thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Mary. Take care. Have a good rest of the day, and I look forward to catching up with you again sometime soon.
You too. Take care.
Take care. Bye.